Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this closing evening that concludes our 5 days of festivities that celebrate our 15-year anniversary at St. John's of being affirming. We last Sunday we celebrated that in worship, and we shared we brought up the documents that proved that in 2007 St. John's became wholeheartedly an affirming congregation. 15 years ago. So to conclude that, all those 5 days of festivities and presentations, we have now the honor and the joy of a conversation with past moderator Gary Paterson, who joins us all the way from Vancouver. But it's about as far as you can get. It's maybe Newfoundland is a little bit further out, but it's we have a 4-hour time difference, which worked to our advantage in this case. So welcome, Gary. I'm delighted you were willing to make the time and you make yourself available for tonight. Just so everybody knows, we were aiming for approximately an hour 15 minutes, depending on how it goes with the Q&A. And immediately following the presentation by Gary, Annika will announce the lucky winners of the pies. We have about 18 pies baked, and they went up for auction. And the lucky winners will be announced immediately following this conversation, just so you know. So hang in there if you want to know if you got the pie or not.
Oh, do you ship any out to the West? Special delivery.
There's one frozen one among them, so we could do that, yes.
Yeah. I love pie.
So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are live streaming from Mi'kma'ki, the territory governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaties. Let us here learn to live not as children of colonialism, but as children of Creator. For only in Creator and in creation will we be truly home. We give thanks for this land and its people. Let us be reconciled together in justice, respect, and wisdom. So once again, thank you so much and welcome, Gary, for being here tonight. To kick things off, maybe we've known you as the moderator from 2012 to 15. Mm-hmm. We know you've been very busy. I also seem to remember that you were ordained 45 years ago, so that's a long history within the United Church. Of course, your husband Tim Stevenson was the first openly gay person to be ordained in the United Church. You've both been and are still very much involved with the United Church's journey to become fully affirming. Have you ever thought about slowing down?
Well, a little bit. I turned 72 last fall, and I finally retired when I was 71 in July. I've been sort of sliding from full-time to half-time to quarter-time. Somebody said kicking and screaming, but not quite. And now I'm minister emeritus at my home congregation, St. Andrew's Wesley United Church, downtown Vancouver, which means that I have permission to hang around and be very careful not to interfere. So occasionally I will be doing something, or it just delights me to be joining with you in this celebration. I mean, I want to start off by saying congrats to St. John's, Halifax. I mean, 15 years, and you were the first in the Halifax Peninsula and the second in the Maritimes. And I know for a fact it's not easy being one of the first. You sort of paved the way for others who might have had perhaps an easier time of it. But bravo to you, really bravo. So you mentioned that I had 45 years of ministry, and people need to know that I'm sort of United Church bred and born all the way throughout my life. I don't believe in an intervening God, but I sometimes have said as a joke that God looked at me and he said, I want you to be a minister. You really, you're going to be a minister, but your dad is an army sergeant and your mother is from farming stock. So you could end up being quite a conservative SOB if you weren't careful. So I think I'm going to make you gay so that you never quite fit in the norm. But you're clearly also called to be a dad. So I'm going to confuse you for a decade and introduce you to a most delightful woman with whom I fell madly in love. And we had long conversations before marriage. And I said, well, I'm at least bi, and this is a risk, but I love you. Blah, 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 blah. And so we got together and had 10 good years and 3 children. And then I said, I'm falling apart. The gay stuff reemerged and I had to deal with it. So I said to God, okay, I am a gay minister, and now what do I do? And is there going to be a place for me in the church? And so over the decades, it turns out that there is a place. You see, because when I first became aware of being a gay person, somewhere in the 60s, wrapped up in the middle of adolescent puberty, hormones everywhere, and I became frighteningly aware that I was attracted to men. And this was not in the book at all. And so I started to research and realized that in the eyes of the government, I was a criminal and would remain as such until 1969. The medical profession said I was sick all the way through, and it wasn't changed until 1973. And even just this year, the government finally passed anti-conversion therapy laws. Just as an aside, people sometimes say, oh, conversion, you shake it off. But I actually had a young man come into my office sobbing and saying, could I help him? His partner had been convinced by his evangelical family to return home and undergo conversion therapy at the local church in Eastern Vancouver. And about halfway through, he killed himself, committed suicide. And the partner was not welcome, was blamed. And he was coming to me saying, can you just even say a prayer? I don't know how to cope. So having anti-conversion therapy laws on the books is an important thing. So at that point, I realized I needed to figure out how to be a half-time dad, and then fell in love with a gay man who just happened to be Tim Stevenson. And there was certainly a time, I think some friend told me from Ontario, oh, when I think of gay people in the church, I think of you and Tim, and I see you as Mr. and Mr. Gay United Church. And there may have been a time when we played that role. But I remember when I was moderator and giving my final accountability report, I actually started to tear up when I said to this gathered community, my people, my home, to say, I don't know what I would have done with my life if the church in 1988 had said, there's no place for you. It was this incredible welcome. I'm sure we had lots of other stuff to work on, and it wasn't 100%, but it felt like the movement of the Spirit and a place for me to be. And so I found a home. Didn't make it easy always, but nevertheless, the alternative would have been so much worse.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now you've been very much involved with the affirming movement, both and your husband. Can you tell us a little bit how that started, where it originated, and how you became involved?
Okay. Well, we almost need to backtrack to 1982 to the General Council meeting held in Montreal. And at that point, there were very secret gatherings of LGBT folk, mainly L and G. People didn't have much understanding of bisexuality or transgendered or two-spirited. And a number of people came to that council meeting, and on a Saturday evening, they crept out of the main session and went into backstair, up into literally an upper room. And there they created the organization that came to be known as Affirm. Small, but they built a structure, and it's been going strong ever since, and growing and then expanding its tasks. So its initial thrust was around support for people, both lay and ordered, and then focused a lot on an acceptance and also the question of ordination. And that became a prime focus of the work. But when that actually happened, and that itself was miraculous, they decided that they needed to expand. Initially, it was a separate group, recognition that often people who are oppressed need a private space where they can just unload, and I've seen that with women's groups who say, we love you guys, but not right now, just take your place elsewhere. Or people of color saying, we need time alone, or Indigenous people who say we need to pull away. So that's what happened with Affirm. But then there was a separate organization called Friends or Allies. And eventually those two groups came together. And then there was a recognition that although the welcome had been stated, it needed to be embodied. It needed to be rooted in congregations, because there was an awful lot of upset within the United Church after the decision of 1988. Like the sessional committee started with a broad representation of 24 people from across the country with various theologies. But they walked in with 1,800 proposals from various congregations across the country, most of them against the sexuality report. And many of them on top put a Bible. And you knew you were in for it. I wasn't there, but my spouse, Tim, was asked to be there as an ex officio member to present the perspective of a gay person and how this would impact. So it got through, but there were concerns. And so Affirm United and S'Affirmer Ensemble decided that they wanted to develop a program for affirming congregations. And so they started off and developed the first outline of it in 1992. And eventually the Church St. Augustine in Winnipeg took them up on the offer and became the first affirming congregation of the United Church in February of 1995. And by the end of that year, there were 5 affirming congregations across the country. I'm not sure which ones, but 5 willing to say, count me in. And then from there, it just took off slowly, however, slowly. I think we're now at 250, which is about 10% of United Church congregations. And there's some question about why isn't every congregation affirming? And I've even seen some suggested proposals saying they should make it a rule that every congregation must become affirming. But I've spent enough time at the national office to realize how unpopular that would be and goes against our congregational roots of saying each congregation has to have its own independence in certain areas, even as we belong together as a corporate body. So it is there and it is increasing. And a lot of churches, I think, say, well, we're already welcoming. Why do we need to go through an affirming process? I confess that my own home church, St. Andrew's Wesley, was one of those, saying we have an out gay minister, the leader of our gospel choir is gay, we do marriages, we walk in the parade. But then we realized, no, it needed to be explicitly stated and to be fundamental to who we are so that the welcome was known and was absolutely clear. And so it kept working away and working away. And so it's a growing thing. But you have to stop and recognize that affirming work in any form is usually difficult. I've spent a lot of time thinking, what is it that blocks people? And sometimes it's just ignorance. You don't know enough. You need to read a few books. You need to meet some people, particularly meeting some people. The United Church is huge in terms of doing educational work. I mean, we did our first sexuality report in 1980. And then in 1984, we had our other report. And then in 1988, we had the next report. And then we had education happening every which way, which is incredibly helpful, but then also doesn't deal with not just ignorance, but I'd say the next level is a high level of discomfort or even fear or apprehension. The LGBTQ2S person is seen as the other. I think we feel that often in our attempts to be anti-racist. And how do you deal with someone who is different, who is other? And what kind of fear undergirds that? Because one of the things that I found, I was at a workshop before 1988, and somebody who came from Alberta, that doesn't necessarily mean you're conservative, but he was, and he ended the whole weekend session up at Naramata saying, well, you're a great minister, I'm sure, but I don't know how to go home if I say amen to you and teach my kids how to live a proper life. That is to say, the act of somebody being very different from the norms that he had grown up with and identified with was ungrounding and unsettling. And so you'll find a lot of that. The minute you meet someone who does things differently from you, it makes you question the rightness of your way. Is it the only way? Oh, it's not the only way. Just on a trivial matter, I found that when I visited Thailand as a tourist and discovered they have a whole different way of cataloging time. No BCAD. It's just different, which is exciting, but then you have to question the reality of your model. And then there's a scarier level that I've discovered now and then, that often people begin to project on the other, in this case LGBT people, some of their own worries or concerns or their own hangups, and you move to real projection and really finding you demonize the other. And so they become the enemy that takes care of all your scapegoating needs. So you blame them. One of the more painful and interesting examples of that is just been recently in the war in Ukraine. Many of you may have heard Patriarch Kirill of the Moscow Patriarch, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, saying Ukraine started the war, and they were set on this path because they were encouraged to allow gay parades. And so gay parades is really the root of this war. And we are called not into a military battle only, but also a battle of values and of souls. And I'm thinking, well, okay, it feels like you're giving me a lot of power. One gay parade doth a war make. It's like people used to say, oh, there is a gay agenda. That was more said in the States. And I thought, right, we have a gay agenda. I get up, I do a workup, I go to work, I do the shopping, I take care of kids. But somewhere between 1 and 1:15 in the afternoon, I do the gay agenda thing and I take over the country, the churches. You realize how deeply people are wanting to demonize. And then you begin to see how that can then move in any fields. Talk to any Jew, talk to people who endured slavery and racism. You realize that same demonization happens. In fact, I had a Jewish friend, and he said his mom said, always watch how they persecute LGBT people, because you know that the Jews are next. And it was almost that sense of society finding its scapegoat. So pink triangles in Germany, Nazi times, thousands, multi-thousands of gay people, lesbian people were exterminated. So that's sort of the extreme. And partly I have some understanding of that and say, so gay affirming work takes time, takes some patience. Sometimes I need to listen to stuff that makes me go, and then I think, no, just listen, don't react, and then see where we find common ground. And partly just tell my own story, and what it was like to tell about moments standing in my home church in Vancouver, weeping before God, saying, I don't know what to do. Do I leave my marriage? And there are 3 children. So to do that would be to chop off my left arm. But if I don't live as a gay person, I'm living a lie. So that's chopping off my right arm. So God, you tell me, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to chop off? And to hear that kind of authentic struggle, it's not a chosen lifestyle. It is the reality of who I am. And that helps people, I think, understand. But there's no question that affirming work is difficult. And just because of who I am and who my spouse is, we were at the heart of it for many, many decades and still continue to be in whatever way is helpful for other people. Talks like this, I've given a couple of sermons for congregations that have just celebrating the fact they've become affirming congregations. So it's difficult. We need to persevere and say we need more and more. And not only in our own churches, but in our social settings as well, to do whatever we can with schools or neighborhoods to say, how do they become affirming? Throw me another question there, Herbert.
Okay. Well, as you already mentioned, St. John's was the first congregation on the Halifax Peninsula to become affirming. That was 15 years ago, and we are celebrating this. We make a big deal out of it. And of course now we've with Annika joining us about 2 years ago. We also started celebrating PIE Day to be public, implicit, and intentional and explicit. Yep. And about who and what we are. So it's really, we're shouting it off the rooftops. We don't keep it low key. We really want to bring it out there. What would you have any ideas, any suggestions where we could take it next after 15 years of being affirming, embracing the PIE idea? Where can we take it next?
Well, I think PIE was just a wonderful creation, also coming from Affirm United and Affirming Ensemble, of saying a little bit like your question, saying, so now we're affirming, now what? And so this organization tried to push us congregations to say, can you not just hide your candle under a bushel, but can you state it loud and clear and be public and explicit and intentional? And just being present as that, as much as one can in the community, is so important. I mean, you probably know some of the statistics that the suicide rate for LGBTQ2S teenagers is triple the rate as it is for their straight peers. They need to see there's a place of acceptance. They don't need what I had to experience of being a criminal and then a sick person from the medical profession and then damned by the church and going straight to hell. They need to be touched. There are so many people who've grown up with I would say, a very limited and destructive view of Christianity. And so the United Church becomes a refuge and a home for some people from an extremely conservative evangelical background or from a Catholic background. And there's a story a man shared in our congregation, David, who heard about us from a friend. And he had grown up in an evangelical family and tried his best to de-gay himself so that he could be faithful. And it just didn't work until finally he said, I'm a gay man. I can't do anything about it. He left his church and he left the faith. And it had been years since he darkened a church door. And because of his friend's encouragement, he crept in on a Sunday morning to St. Andrew's Wesley, slid into the back pew so that he could make a fast exit if need be and if it became a dangerous place. And he got there and started to feel quite choked up. And then he said, I heard a voice in my head, in my heart. I don't know where it was, but this voice said, oh, David, I have missed you. Welcome home. And he said, I spent the rest of the service crying because for me, that was the voice of God saying, I was missed and I was loved and I found my way home. And so that kind of PIE quality is so important so that people actually see and know who you are. They've managed to start this. I think they've worked hard at it. We even celebrated a PIE service at General Council. It's a sort of a recent event, National Affirming Day, March 14th, PIE Day, Public Intentional Explicit. You probably know the background to it, that it's actually piggybacking on top of PIE, PI, the mathematical term, which in 2009 was officially declared by the Assembly of Representatives in the States to be the National PIE Day. And so I just think there was some wonderfully witty, clever person with the firm that said, let's double up on this and we'll turn it into our own day. So I think that kind of thing is so helpful. And there are many ways of doing that. And I just happen to think you may, in fact, ask me that kind of question. And so I thought, okay, what are some other what are some other steps? And I'd like to just share some of the things that that I've been engaged in, or I know that other churches have. One of them is that this may sound strange, you pray for people who are different from you. At the end of 1988, one of the other commissioners grabbed me after and said, Gary, I'm going to pray for you. And I said, Jim, if you're going to pray to Jesus, he was quite conservative, and ask him to change me into a happy heterosexual, I want you to take your prayers off my body. And Jim said, no, Gary, I'm not praying for that. I'm just holding you up to God and into God's love and light. And my deepest wish is that you would do the same for me. And the two of us looked at each other and you could feel the spirit there. And so I said, Jim, I can pray for you. You pray for me, and we'll see what happens. 2 years later, at the annual meeting of conference, still conference in those days, Jim grabbed me and said, come for a coffee. And off we went. He said, I just need to say thank you to you for your prayers and for your witness and for what you and Tim have done in our part of the church. He said, my son came out to me last year, and if I had not had the church and prayer, I would have tossed him out of the family. Instead, we sat down and talked to each other. And here's a kicker. 2 years later, Jim came to me and said, time for another coffee. Oh, okay, sat down. He said, I just want you to know that I presided at my son's marriage last summer. And I thought, now that's a hallelujah moment. And so I invite you to think about what prayer might have looked like. I'm also saying that we are called to be in conversation and into dialogue, partly with people. Okay, Andre Bernard. Okay, partly we need to talk and be in partnership or conversation with people that we disagree with. I don't always find that easy. I'm sometimes quick to jump, but I think that dialogue needs to keep happening, and so that we slowly lead into change and deeper understanding each with the other. And as an affirming congregation, you're well placed to maybe just have information forums or gatherings with, and make the invitation to places that you perhaps wouldn't expect much response. I also think it's really important to be in dialogue with our partners in the world, with allies. I'm convinced that the church needs to be about love and justice in the world, and some of God's Spirit is already at work in the world. And so we need to find out where that's already happening and say, can we join you? And so to be in discussion with local LGBTQ2S groups and say, how can we be on side? Is there any way that we can be supportive? So you might have straight gay alliances at the schools, and sometimes they need a space or a home or a word of support. I understand that you have a gender and sexuality support group. I think wonderful, wonderful. You might check and see if the parents and friends of lesbians, gays, PFLAG, if it's got a space in its meeting, and can you be supportive there? I mentioned earlier to Hubert and to Annika, there's a church in Montreal, and they talked to the Straight Gay Alliance at schools, and what they heard was that the LGBT community wanted their own prom in addition to the regular school prom, because their particular schools were not allowing same-gender couples to attend. And so the church sponsored, under their guidance, another dance. It wasn't exclusively for the LGBT community, but it was for friends or allies or family, and they had a blast. I'm all for figuring out creative ways that we can announce that we are affirming congregations. The Shaughnessy United up in a very Tony part of Vancouver, like la-di-da, many rich mansions, and they got 7 doors, old doors, and they painted them in the rainbow colors. And then they put God's welcome is for everyone on the doors. And they put it as an art installation on the lawn in front of their church. Well, people buzzed about it in the neighborhood. Church people said, well, look at us, until about the third day, somebody in the middle of the night came and poured white paint all over the doors, which turned out to be an incredibly good moment, because it meant that the people at Shaughnessy were being interviewed by CBC, local radio stations, and they started to get all kinds of phone calls from the neighborhood saying, we are so sorry that happened. We are so supportive. Can we buy some fresh paint for you? And it suddenly became the bridge to the neighborhood that they were looking for. And then they let it be a traveling art installation. So it came to St. Andrews Wesley downtown, a church on the east side. I think it's now standing on the lawn of a fifth church. So there are creative ways. Another church, downtown church, painted the stairs in rainbow colors and then put a phrase down, all of you is welcome here. And I looked and said, I used to teach English. That's too lousy grammar. All of you are welcome here. Are, not is. No, they said. You singular, all of you. Your gayness, your queerness, your ability, your disability, all of you is welcome here. And there's a bus stop right in front of that church. And so I saw a number of people read it and do the double take. All of you is well. Oh, all of me is well. And it's led to wonderful, wonderful conversations. Or let me tell you about, I'm assuming you've probably then been in the Gay Pride in Halifax. So the first year that I was at St. Andrews Wesley, that was in 2005, you'd think by then it would have been easy, but it still was a bit contentious in the congregation. 20 or 30 people left, including the second biggest donor, the treasurer. So I was trying to be careful, saying, I'll give them time to get used to me. But some people said, I think we should be in the Pride Parade. They had never been in the Pride Parade. And so I asked one of the fellows in the congregation if he would take some responsibility. He said, sure. And I was imagining a car, maybe a banner, 10, 15 people, little pamphlets saying, welcome, we're welcoming. Well, he came back to me in a couple of weeks and said, look, I approached a couple of gay guys in the congregation. Won't cost you a penny, but I have a few $1,000. I've rented a 46-foot flatbed truck. I have a committee together. We're building a replica of the church, complete with stained glass windows. I have booked a professional recording for our gospel choir, and they have agreed to bolt down some pews on the truck, and the gospel choir will record and then sing or mouth the words. And then the leader of the gospel choir came up to me and said, you know it's going to be hot. Is it okay if I go shirtless? And I thought, oh, okay. He said, I do have a nipple ring. I said, that's cool. That's cool. And suddenly we had 82 people marching from the congregation, age from 2 to 84. The 80s were up sitting on the pews on the stand. I did put a small prayer out to God saying, please, God, let none of the risque bars be close to us. The last thing the church crowd needs are naked men showing off their stuff and strutting. And God said, you're on. And so right behind us was an organization called Women Against Violence Against Women. And they're a wonderful group, but very radical. And so they went bare-breasted aside from pasties and held on to broom handles just so that they were walking in rhythm. And when our gospel choir was singing, they thought it was the right rhythm. And so I'm just asking you to imagine everything swinging in gospel rhythm sync. And there wasn't one eye, gay or straight, that wasn't on our float, or what they thought was an addition to our float. And we won first prize, top float in the parade. And there were several people who came the following Sunday and said, we're not gay, but we want to belong or be part of a church that offers that kind of welcome. So it was one of our great moments. And me, the scared minister, was trumped by far more adventuresome and willing to take risk members of the congregation. And then they decided that they wanted to organize what they call Spirit Pride, a major conference on Pride Week, where they looked at sexuality and spirituality and offered it to everybody, but particularly aimed for conservative background congregations or ministers. And so we've had several Salvation Army ministry staff, a lot of evangelical staff or members coming, and they would learn more. So for instance, we had a panel with an imam had to be from Toronto. We didn't have an openly gay or supportive imam here in Vancouver, a rabbi and an Anglican dean. And the three of them talked about their traditions, understanding of response to LGBT concerns and issues. So it's educational, but you put yourself out there as being an educator. The other thing is things that are probably obvious to you. I mean, right now, so many parts of our society are wrestling with the rights for transgenders people. And so what can you do to be on side? And do you have a non-gendered bathroom so that people will feel comfortable? And we did an upgrade and have a non-gendered. And it's interesting, somebody in the congregation came and said, I am so glad to see that there. I'm at home here. That's a sort of one of those strong symbolic statements. The other thing is that you might be aware of the need to expand our vision from Canada into the world. I sometimes feel like I'm in a bubble within Vancouver, within the United Church, within Canada. I think we are one of the most accepting of countries, despite the barriers that we still face. So when I was moderator, for instance, part of the moderator's task is to visit with our church partners around the globe and to go there and to listen and then bring back their stories or their hurts or their struggles back to the community here in Canada. Well, it was time for a moderator to visit our partners in Africa, and they said, please don't come. And I said, why is that? Well, you're gay. And I said, look, I'm not a one-string band. I can talk a lot about many things besides gay issues. And they said, no, it's not that. It's that anybody that is seen talking to you or supporting you will be in danger once you leave. And so we can't take that risk. We're doing some of the work. I've actually invited priests. This was an Anglican from South Africa, where in fact being gay is not a barrier. And we're learning from ourselves. You come, you look like another colonial old white guy with gray hair, and you will put other people in danger. But our partners in South America said, please come and come and do a workshop on the United Church's experience of the inclusive community and the LGBT story. And by the way, could you bring your spouse? We know that you're married. And I said, are you sure? And they said, yes. And we ended up doing workshops in Colombia and in Cuba. And people were incredibly receptive. And now the Methodist Church of Colombia has, in the last 3 or 4 years, ordained its first out lesbian minister. And the change actually happens. But you probably know that in over 70 countries of the world, being gay is still punishable in one form or another. In fact, 7 countries still have the death penalty on the books. And so the United Church, in consultation with partners, said, how can we be of help? We don't want to be, we know it all, or our way is the right way, or we're superior, but how can we work with you or be supportive? And they said, if you could develop a fund, and it's called now the Global Solidarity with LGBTQ2S Fund in the United Church, you can commit or contribute through the congregation or individually through the foundation or through the mission and service. And their main work in the last 3 or 4 years, 2 sort of runaway centers, one in Uganda and one in Jamaica, both homophobic capitals of the world. And they are sort of runaways, they're shelters, they're for LGBT youth, a safe space, and they're trying to support them. And we've helped fund at least 2 or 3 church conferences where they're trying to bring ministers and key lay people together to talk about the LGBT issues. So there's one in Africa and one in India, where they're learning among themselves and asking the questions that they want to ask. And so I really invite you to consider not only what you need to do locally, but also what you need to do further and abroad. The other work is refugee work. And again, partnering with something like the Rainbow Railroad or the Rainbow Refugee Committee, which is what we do in Vancouver. Some congregations have said, we are going to give a priority to LGBTQ refugees because they are in double jeopardy, not only running from whatever war zone or economic starvation, but they are also persecuted for being LGBT. And so they need, so I think one of the downtown churches has sponsored about 8 or 9 different LGBT refugees. And that would be another way to focus and to make clear what you're doing. I'll stop there because it sounds like homework. But
No,
I don't know your context, but
this is inspiring to hear. Thank you so much for that. And as you were talking about that, I also realized that, of course, we've all heard the stories of the 1988 decision. Is that cost the church, I don't know, about half of its membership, and that's the stupidest thing that the United Church could have done. But as time goes by, we realize 2 things in the first place: all denominations are in decline, whether they are affirming or not. That doesn't make any difference. So it would have happened to the United Church anyway. But I think it also looks like being outspoken and being a PIE about being affirming is an opportunity. It's actually an opportunity. It's slightly risky, sure, but all good opportunities are risky, aren't they? And we can reach out and we can offer a home to folks who are looking for one.
Oh yeah, and let me clarify something. I wasn't sure I was going to do this, but this is exciting. The sessional committee was drawn from representatives across the country, representing both the geography variations and the theological variations. They all arrived a week early, and 2 of them were in support. There are 24, 2 were in support, and 5 were saying we're absolutely against, and the others said we're sort of open to listening. The chairperson was Marion Best, and she talked them into making decisions by consensus. Like if one person disagreed, it wouldn't go forward. And over that week, the committee moved from being polarized mainly against Bible, 1,800 petitions, and they came with full agreement for the report that finally issued. And to demonstrate that, all members of the committee went up on stage and stood with the chairperson and said, all of us support this. And there was just no way you couldn't think of it as a movement of the Spirit. I mean, I don't know how it happened. I still don't know. And when it was debated at General Council on the floor, you still felt the movement of that Spirit. People who came to determined to vote it down, found themselves changed. And I want to point out, we did not lose half. They say that they probably lost 25,000 people. But at that point, the membership of the United Church was over 1 million. And so it was more like 5 to 10%. And that's all that we lost. It's been talked up, and we've certainly declined since then. But as you pointed out, every mainline denomination has shrunk over that time, some by even greater margins than we have. And just not that I'm gloating about my evangelical brethren, but they also are now discovering the decline has hit them as well. And they are getting really worried because young adult millennials, they ain't coming back. And that's true, for instance, of the Southern Baptists, who are now having a bit of a fit. We're just 20 years ahead of them. So, in fact, it was a taking of a risk, but the cost was not high. The vote at General Council was like, I think it was like 3-1 in favor, and it was raised again at Fergus the fall 2 years later, and a similar vote was taken, and this time it was 80% in favor and only 20% against. So, in fact, you jump off the cliff and you find that there's water waiting for you, not rocks. It's still scary and still takes your breath away, but then you get to swim.
We have to work towards our to wrapping it up, but not before I have one more question to ask, and then we'll go to some Q&A. And I know that one question is already in the chat box, so we'll look into that in a few moments. But to wrap it up, you already alluded to the fact that you as a young man, you were very confused about your sexuality. You were struggling with it. You felt you had to make some impossible choices. Of course, things have changed in some ways. You might say it, but it's still extremely hard for anyone to acknowledge that my sexuality doesn't fit the boxes. I don't fit into what people think is the norm. And it's scary. It's dangerous to come out sometimes. It can be intimidating to say to your friends, your family, I'm not straight.
Yeah.
Would you have any words, as someone who has lived through that, would you have any words of support or comfort for those folks who might be watching this right now?
Yeah. Part of Tim's and my call was to say we don't want younger people to have to go through the struggles that we went through. Like, for instance, my spouse fought tooth and nail to not accept being gay until he was age 30. I mean, he even went to Billy Graham crusades, took a born again experience, and finally ended up in hospital with a breakdown. And so I don't want that to happen for anybody. But you're right. Nobody wants to be part of the minority. I mean, whether it's 10 or 5 or 3%, you know that you're different. And you know that your parents will love you, hopefully, but not necessarily. And their dreams, maybe of grandchildren, may shift. And again, that's changed, and adoption and surrogacy and what have you. But it means, and I've talked to parents who say, I support my child being LGBT, but I want life to be easy for them, or as easy as this. It looks like it's making more difficult. So my advice is really, and this came from my father, who was an Army sergeant. And when I finally came out to my dad, I was expecting rejection. And instead, this guy never hugs, but this time he hugged me. He said, I don't understand any of this, and I'm not sure I like it, but you're my son, and I love you, and nothing will ever change that. And then he doesn't cry a lot, but there were some tears, and I cried, and we had this huge hug. So I think what people need most of all is, one, a sense that they're okay, even loved, if it's family, if it's a good friend, and a willingness to be present and to walk with. And even if you disagree, saying, I respect your choice, and it won't be easy. And also maybe to be someone who can do some of the research and say, you might find it helpful to go to the Gay Straight Alliance. You might find it helpful. There's a group meeting at the community center that you might find supportive. Let me look around. If you want some counseling just to help you in the transition, not to cure you, I'll do some of that work, for there will be gay positive counselors or therapists around. And for the people that are struggling, hang in there. Dan Savage and another group of gay people in the States made a series of videos from older gay men saying, it gets better. It gets better. I mean, teenage years are not easy at the best of times. And now with Instagram and social media, displaying your body, not being at the party. It is rough being a teenager. As I mentioned, my grandchild has declared that they are now non-binary, and it's a tough journey, even in these times. So love and affirmation and respect are the key words to go with that. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful and for everyone to hear, but especially if you're struggling with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
We're going to do questions in a few minutes, but I want to say one other thing, and that is to stretch the notion of being an affirming congregation with its explicit affirmation of LGBTQ2S folk, and to realize that being affirming, inclusive, and welcoming is in the DNA of the United Church. From day one, when we had to figure out a way that Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists could live together, I think we just have that built into us, saying, how do we live with difference? Or to say, unity does not look like uniformity. And so we wrestled with the place of women. And we were one of the first denominations in 1936 to ordain Lydia Grucci. And then Lois Wilson was our first woman as moderator in 1980. We've been struggling over the last several years how to be an intercultural church or an anti-racist church, and having to realize that we are racist, not intentionally, not nastily, but it happens. Or how do we really build bridges of reconciliation with Indigenous brothers and sisters that are authentic and enlivening and brings us together? Over and over. 2015, we adopted at the General Council the study paper on the theology of disabilities. And I've just been watching where people with disabilities have more and more of a place in the church. And so that there are some churches now just regularly have a signer for the service, which just opens up an avenue and a part for those who are deaf and for whom signing is their language. So it's to say, how do we live as an affirming presence in the world, not only for LGBTQ, but for everyone? How do churches become embodied places of affirmation and of love and acceptance, and therefore of gospel and good news? How do we live out that calling? I had one friend who said that we need to be people with a soft front and a strong back, meaning you're just there embracing, but that there is substance to you at the same time. And there are so many ways of trying to work on that. One of the things is a line that's been dear to me comes from Margaret Mead, the sociologist. Remember, she said, never doubt that a small group of committed and informed citizens can change the world. In fact, that is the only thing that ever has changed the world. And so what would it be like for St. John's to be one of those small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens? You have a capacity to change the world. And I'll throw one other quotation at you that comes from the Swiss Anglo philosopher Alain de Botton, who said, the difference between hope and despair is a different way of telling stories from the same set of facts. And I think the United Church is called to look at the facts of LGBTQ and other minorities or outcast groups in our society and say, we see the facts and we're going to tell a different story, not of put downs, not of harassing and bullying, not of blame, scapegoating, alienation. We are going to tell a story of love and acceptance and an embrace and a recognition of we follow a God who loves diversity. Look at it. I love monarch butterflies, but did you know that there are 18,000 different species of butterflies in the world? Like, who needs that many? Well, it seems like God does. And so my task is to honor that diversity as much as I possibly can. So affirming, you act on the specifics, and then you begin to see that as a broad presence. You're called to be in the world, which I think fits with our church's new vision statement, deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice. And I think St. John's is exemplifying that kind of commitment. So bravo to all of you. And I just piled more work on your plate. So,
Actually,
we can check in a year or two from now.
Yeah, we should.
I'll have more suggestions.
And we'll send you a pie.
Yes, yes,
As we were checking in before we started this officially at the start of this conversation, you mentioned a song, a hymn.
yes. Um, Shirley Irna Murray is a New Zealand hymn writer, and several of her hymns are in our Songs for Gospel People, quite wonderful. And she wrote a song that is, well, just a deep song of inclusion. A while back, I was passing by a church, Canadian Memorial, here in Vancouver, and on the great big bulletin board in front of the church, they said, "Do not ever build a bigger wall, just build a longer table." And I imagine that if Jesus had been there, he'd say amen and hustle home to get his carpenter tools and start building that table with people. And I mean, we have only to look at the endlessly affirming ministry of Jesus and the number of people he invited to the table, from tax collectors to Samaritans to Romans to fishermen to lepers to you name it. Everybody was welcome. And this song, these lyrics are part of that. For everyone born, there's a place at the table. For everyone born, clean water and bread, a space, a place for all growing. For everyone born, a star overhead. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. Oh, God will rejoice when we are creators of justice and joy. For trans woman man, there's a place at the table, revising the roles, dividing the share. With wisdom and grace, discerning the power. For trans woman and man, a system that's fair. For young and for old, there's a place at the table. A voice to be heard, a part of the song. The hands of a child in hands that are wrinkled. For young and for old, the right to be heard. For gay and for straight, only it's broader than that, but it doesn't sing as well. For LGBTQ2S and straight, there's a place at the table, a welcoming space, a covenant shared, a rainbow of race and gender and colored. For LGBTQ2S and straight, a chalice of grace. For everyone born, there's a place at the table to live without fear and simply to be. To work, to speak out, to witness, to worship, for everyone born the right to be free. And God will rejoice when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy.
We'll take that
That's a hymn
directly.
that's worth the learning.
We'll take that to our musical director, and I know he will embrace this. We'll be singing it in St. John's.
Right on.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. Well, there's a few questions that have been coming in. I think you saw the first one already. Annika, would you like to facilitate the questions from this point on?
Sure, I can. So the first question was from Andre Bernard, and I think that's some of the one that you answered. How can the church best support those marginalized by society and indeed our church, and how do we move forward?
Can I just interject?
Sure.
Hi, Gary, Andre, Bernard, and Sean.
Hi.
We met a long time ago when I was in my late teens. My question is really like, how do we push us forward? Because one of the interesting paradoxes of the United Church is that as we succeed in our fight for justice, for inclusion, we go through periods of plateau where we just say, look at what all we've done. And when Sean and I spoke on Sunday at church, we are the product of privilege. My childhood was that of oppression, but my adulthood now as a white cisgender male is the opposite of that. And in fact, I think I have a lot of responsibility, and Sean and I talk about it all the time, to how to move it forward. But how does the church institutionally move it forward? You began to address it, I think, in some of the comments you made.
Mm-hmm. I think actually that's why PIE had it. That's the dilemma in which PIE had its origins, saying we've done so much, we can rest on our laurels, but can we actually make ourselves more public and intentional and explicit? So I think there are issues like trans people are struggling, and I don't know what in your community would be a place of support. or how to support them. It's more like, how can we be supportive? So I remember I was asked by a group of trans sex trade workers if I would be the facilitator with 3 police as we tried to negotiate what's the relationship between police, law enforcement, trans, and sex trade workers. Somebody in our congregation was a support person for a group called Boys Are Us, which is the young men just about 8 blocks from the church that are sex trade workers for drive-by older gay guys. And we thought maybe we should do a drop-in for them. And somebody said, no, you church people are far too naive for that. But what would be helpful is the occasional visit with another counselor or a support person, and collecting socks and underwear and then candy, because a lot of the guys are kind of trying to come off some kind of addictive substance, and sometimes candy helps. So for 3 or 4 years, we raised that, and then had an after church lunch, and 3 or 4 members of Boys R Us came and spoke. And you could hear a pin drop when one who was not trans, but a cross-dresser said, I will cross-dress because I get double my rate. And I could just see a whole group of church people going, is that so? We are very open and accepting, but then to hear of cross-dressing to get a double rate for your sex trade work. And yet, so we made some explicit partnerships. The Dr. Peter Center for people living with HIV or AIDS, and they needed a huge space to display the AIDS quilt when it was on travel. So we paid for the installation. It was heavy enough. You needed to have all kinds of stuff put up in the church, and so we partnered there. We partnered and given a major grant of, I think it was $300,000 to Rainbow Refugees, so that they could do that grunt work. And we would do some sponsoring, but they were sponsoring so many others. So there are these initiatives that I think the church can take, and you need to ask the allies, the people already doing much of the work who are on the front line, what might be helpful. And I'm not sure. So we run a parents and tots group. How do we make that a welcoming space for same-gendered parents, and to make sure they feel welcome and included, and also to be available if there is if issues arise. And that's partly what I also meant by the global record. I think the Global Solidarity Fund offered through our church is masterful, and I think it's really important. I know that when I was at the World Council as moderator in Korea, I spent my day off up in Seoul with a couple of gay groups, and the kind of support they need from people like us who, you're right, I'm privileged compared to the reality of so many other people in the world, and so many other people who are have intersectionality issues. So there's an issue of race as well as an issue of orientation. I think transgenders people have to be the bravest in the world. I think being gay is a snap compared to sorting out what it means for you to be transgender. And our society is not anywhere near ready for full acceptance there. So I could go on, but I think looking for opportunities and asking the groups, the LGBT community where you find yourself, what might be helpful? Because the last thing you want is the church to go blundering in with good intentions and not be helpful and perhaps even do damage. So you ask, but you make it explicit too, and don't back down. Yeah.
Margot and John, do you want to ask your question as well? And then folks, just pop me a message or raise your hand and I can put you in order, because I kind of like that idea. And if you're on Facebook, pop her in the chat.
We can't hear you, John. You're very muffled. I'll repeat the question that John typed in the comments box. He said, Gary, so much of what you say applies here. What advice do you have about encouraging other congregations to work with us? What strategies work?
John, I don't have a set answer for that. I think one possibility would be something like Spirit Pride Conference, where you deliberately partner with other churches to put on an educational forum around LGBT issues, or a Q&A so that it becomes something that is actually shared. Or it could be like, if there's an issue that emerges within the community, and then the church could be at the forefront of trying to bring players together, including other congregations. So as I mentioned, the having white paint thrown on the Shaughnessy doors turned out ironically to be a godsend, because it led other people to say, oh, I hadn't realized we still had that kind of homophobia around. Yeah, and my own experience is that the biggest change comes always when an LGBT person is able and willing to tell his or her story, and to sort of put flesh and blood and a face and an experience to it. And I don't know if a church would ever have that wasn't already affirming, but if you were able to say, we're willing to, we have some women or men or trans folk who are willing and able to speak of their experience, if you would ever like to have, either within worship, or that might be pressing too close to the edge for them, an after worship lunch and talk. And you'd lose a number of people, but you might get enough to say it's a first and small step. I think sharing stories is ultimately the only way. If every LGBTQ person suddenly turned purple, it would be amazing. And here's a story for the 1984 committee that was doing the first report on whether LGBT folk could be ordained. A number of us who were meeting in Toronto decided that we would make our visit to the committee. So they were in the chapel, and 15 of us just took a deep breath. And for over half of us, it was a coming out moment. And the committee was people, they were my friends. They knew me, but they knew me as Gary, married, 3 kids, a nice minister. And all of a sudden, I'm arriving and saying, I'm gay. And it transformed that committee. They kept saying, oh, but. And all of a sudden, there was that astounding moment of saying, I never knew. Yeah.
Thanks. Lance, you're up.
I'm a member of the GSA at St. John's, and we've had a wonderful 5-day event for PIE. So we have really been pounding it. We had a wonderful evening on Saturday night, and we had a transgender person reading poetry, and we had a Two-Spirit person, and we got talking about mental health. And we at our GSA have talked numerous times about where do we fit in from a pastoral care point of view. Can we pick up some of this slack in the mental health area? Our guest on Saturday night was saying it has been very good to get therapy, but the cost of therapy, and then you go and get the therapy, and then they say, come back in 6 months. That isn't the need. Is there a place for the church? Thank you.
Okay. First comment is, I don't know. I think it is something that you're right. I think it's a huge issue, mental health. And I'd ask myself, so what is the specific role that a church could play? It may be that you do some of the basic research, maybe it's already been done, of finding counselors who are LGBT positive. It's so important to go to somebody who's experienced and is positive and can help. So in fact, my wife and I, my then wife, we took 2 years of therapy to figure out how to disentangle the marriage and to come out. And then from then on, she was almost on retainer, and she saw my wife and then her partner and me and my partner and all of us as the 4 adults. So if you're lucky, you can find the right therapist. And if it's a psychiatrist, it's covered by Health Canada. The other would be to maybe offer some kind of group at the church. I know that you've got the Gender and Sexuality Association. We have a group called Word is Out at St. Andrews Wesley. And they will once a month come together for deep conversations or issues. And the other night they have a fine social of one form or another, some fun stuff to do. And in that group, it's not therapy per se, but it is being with like-minded people who are willing to share stories and who are able to say, oh, that happened to me, or why don't we go out for a coffee or a glass of wine, and I'll just listen. So I think we can provide safe listening forums with individuals who have walked the road before. And sometimes that doesn't replace therapy, but it can be at least a place of a sounding board and to deal with some basic issues, almost like a 12-step group that says, but I don't want that sense of addiction to go in, but of mutual support and guaranteed confidentiality, and that you are safe here to tell your story. And if you, I'm not sure where else. I mean, it could be also that you train a group of pastoral care elders who have a gift for being with the LGBT community. It might be. I mean, my mom, bless her loved heart, when I was finally completely out, I lived in a glass closet, like everybody knew, but unless you asked, I didn't tell. And then finally, I just shouted it from the rooftop. And so there was no way for people not to know. My mom said, good. And she started up the first P flag. And to get free space, she went to a church and asked for space. Her home church, no go. They were a bit homophobic, but she found space in an Anglican church and they set up there. So maybe to connect to various organizations, or to say, what counseling have other groups found that you might be able to model or support? But I'm just spinning wheels. I'm not sure, because you're right. It can take a long while to get a good therapist, and then so much of it still depends on, can you pay for it? Yeah. I mean, the other is, I don't know what your finances are, but I've never done this, but a bursary fund for people who need therapy. And so part of the church is we will pay for 5 sessions or something like that. So it's an emergency fund.
Thank you so much.
Just as an aside, I knew a church up in Ottawa on a different issue dealing with reconciliation. And this church said, you know, we've now spent the last 2 years saying before every worship service, we recognize that we are on the unceded territory of da-dum. And somebody said, I think we should bloody well do something about it other than just say it. And so they proposed that 10% of the church budget go for actions of reconciliation. And the finance committee had a small freak out and said, we've set the budget for this year. We think it's a good idea, but we're going to need a year to prepare, and then maybe to challenge people. But at the end of that year, they passed that. And they split the 10%. Half of it went to church groups working on reconciliation. Half of it went on Indigenous groups in the city that were doing good work. And so I wonder if there might be a statement, maybe just for 1 year, we pledge X amount, 5% of our budget or 10% for such a bursary. So for instance, if somebody wanted to go to camp, I don't know what's happening in the Maritimes, whether there are rainbow camps. There's, ironically, the only one I know of is in Northern Ontario, of all places. But a couple of guys who said, we're not leaving. It's not gay friendly, but we're going to make it so. And they now run a rainbow camp, which is like, I was never thrilled with camp because I would often be the guy that got teased. But if I had gone to, I don't know if I'd have the courage to go to an LGBT open rainbow camp, but maybe. So there may be some ways that you can maneuver financing. That always seems like a cop-out. But on the other hand, sometimes money speaks.
Great ideas. That's all that I have for questions. Are there any other questions?
I could talk all day, as you know. I'm known by why use one word when 10 will do.
Well, I think I indicated when we started we would be about an hour 15 minutes, and it's 13 minutes past 8. I think we did well.
Okay.
And I don't want to claim you too long. I'd love to have a longer conversation, but maybe some other time.
Yes,
It's
for sure.
we really, really appreciate you being here with us this evening and to help us celebrate what we feel is celebrating 15 years of being affirming.
Yeah.
Thank you so
I
much
think
once again.
that's just wonderful. And I'm so glad to be with you all. So here's to St. John's, and here's to all of you for having done this work and continuing to do it. Yeah. I think it may be it's the longest pie celebration that I've heard about in the country. So bravo. Just as a little aside, did you know that there is actually an American Pie Council, and that it was a guy in the Midwest in the 70s who loved pie and thought there should literally be a national pie day. And so there is an American Pie Council. And in 1986, they declared January 23rd to be National Pie Day because that was the 75th anniversary of Crisco, who continue to serve people well. And so you think, oh, geez, is there nothing that our corporate capitalism can't claim?
I know.
However, we stand differentiated.
Well, our pie day is still a long ways away from corporate commercialism.
This is good.
We'll be moving on. Speaking of pies, Annika will take over from me now and announce the lucky winners of the pie draw. Gary, if you feel like staying, that's fine. But I know you're a busy person, and we also have other things to do. It's up to you.
Okay, I think I'll say goodbye because since I'm not in the running, I can only drool. I can't even hope that my name will be chosen for pie. So blessings on all of you. Enjoy the pie and continue with the fine ministry that you are engaged in and called into by the Holy One.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank
Amen.
you. Bye-bye.